Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the HVI podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Markus Vinzent. And today we're going to be discussing Marcion's Paul and canonical Paul, their differences and similarities. And before we continue, I have the link to Patristica, the YouTube channel. It's tagged in the description below. Markus Vinzent appears over there frequently. So I had the link tagged there. If you're not subscribed already to it, you can click on it and go subscribe. And that being said, Markus, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, Jacob, it's always a pleasure to be with you and your audience.
Thank you, Markus. Let's just do a brief recap. Can you introduce the audience as to who Marcion's Paul is for those unfamiliar?
Yeah, pleasure. For those people who have never heard something about Marcion, and particularly not Marcion's Paul, just a bit of a recap. Marcion, probably from Synoptic, which is today north of Turkey. So if you have Galatia and the Epistle to the Galatians from Paul's in your head, it's roughly that area a bit north of it. We know of two collections, actually, of Paul's letters as witnessed by our witnesses from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. One is the canonical collection that you probably will be familiar with, which is part of the New Testament, the canonical New Testament, and which has 14 letters credited to Paul, whereby only 13 letters carry his name as the one who sends the letters to various addressees, and one doesn't carry the name. It's the letter to the Hebrews, but it's part of the collection of the Pauline letters in the canonical New Testament. Now, this collection of Paul's letters, as we know, has only been put together around the times of Irenaeus of Lyon, which is roughly in the years 177 or 180 AD, which means towards the end of the 2nd century. Now, the witnesses give us notice about an alternative collection of Pauline letters, and these they credit to the mentioned Marcion of Synoptic, and they give us a rough date of that collection, which is around the mid-2nd century, probably a bit earlier, so towards the end of the so-called Second Jewish War, the Bar Kokhba War, that ended in the year 135. So this collection must have been put together between 135 and 140. Now, of course, the interesting question then is which of these collection is not only the younger one or the older one, because that's quite clear from the witnesses that we have. The question rather is, what about the content of these collections? Because the earlier collection that is credited to Marcion only contains 10 Pauline letters, whereas the canonical collection contains 14 letters. But not only is Marcion's collection a collection which has less letters than the canonical one, even those 10 letters, which it has in common with the canonical texts, which means we have exactly those 10 letters per number, as we have them within the 14 letters. So all letters that we have in the Marcionite collection reappear also in the canonical collection. However, not only just the number is smaller in Marcion's collection, it is also that each of those letters is shorter than the same letter as in the canonical collection. I leave it to that and ask Jacob whether he wants to hear a bit more about Marcion and about the contextual evidences, or I'm open to all the questions. And feel free also to ask questions. We are live, so I'm happy to answer your questions rather than portray what I think I know.
Thanks, Markus. Can you tell us, can you give us an idea of how much shorter the Marcionite edition of Paul's letters are compared to the canonical text?
That's quite an interesting question, because not all of the letters are equally shorter in Marcion's collection compared to the canonical collection. For example, there are two outstanding letters which are only slightly smaller in the overall content, and that is Galatians and Ephesians. Whereas we have other letters which are really, compared to the Marcionite collection, much bigger in the canonical collection. First of all, it is Romans. Romans has more than doubled its size in the canonical collection, and entire chapters are missing compared to the canonical one in the Marcionite collection. So in Marcion's collection, for example, as the witnesses also clearly indicate, we are missing Romans chapters 15 and 16. But then, even from earlier chapters, we know big lumps or entire chapters are missing. So, for example, chapter 4, then almost everything is missing from chapters 9 through to chapters 11. And so you can imagine how much bigger the letter to the Romans has become or is in the canonical collection. Very similarly, we have some chapters missing in 2 Corinthians. Chapters 9 or 8 rather to 10, 3 chapters are missing in Marcion's collection. And then when we take 1 Corinthians, which has been slightly big or is slightly bigger in the canonical collection, last chapter, chapter 16, is missing in the Marcionite collection. But equally, we can go to the Deutero-Paulines. So these are the letters that today usually scholarship is not attributing to Paul directly, but to a school of Paul. And this is Ephesians, which I've said is almost or very similar in both editions. But then Colossians, for example, and 2 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians in the canonical collection is much larger, although it's already not that big of a letter. And Colossians, the last chapter, is also entirely missing in the Marcionite collection. And then if you go to Philippians, although again the last chapter is missing in the Marcionite collection, which gives us a feature, as you have already sensed, that quite often the canonical letters have a longer ending. And part of that longer ending is because these endings usually are lists of greetings that the canonical Paul addresses to the addressees.
Does the Deutero-Paulines conflict in any way with with what is believed to be the genuine Pauline epistles within the Marcionite edition, or does it lack those contradictions that show up in the canonical text?
Very, very shrewd question, and I have to answer that this is a very similar contradiction we can notice, and probably even a clearer contradiction, I would say, we notice in the Marcionite collection as well. Just to pick up one example, we have in canonical Ephesians and also in the pre-canonical, as I call the Marcionite collection, just because of the time switch, in the pre-canonical, the Marcionite collection, where the letter has a different addressees, so it's not addressed to Ephesus, but to the city of Laodicea. So in this letter, in both versions, as Laodiceans or as Ephesians, we have the strong emphasis and statement that women should obey and subjugate themselves to their husbands, their men. Now, this is in a stark contrast to Marcion's view, which he takes from the 7 letters. So not from the Deutero-Paulines, but from what we think are genuine Pauline texts. From these 7 letters, he takes the idea that women are equal partners. and that women can prophesy as much as husbands can, or men can. So there is no difference. And each time he talks about and addresses people as brothers in the Marcionite collection, I think one would need to translate that term with brothers and sisters. And yet he has left this kind of a one entity verse that women should be subjugated and obedient to their husbands. He left it in this letter within his collection. Just one example, but also the style, the language in these Deuteropaulines, and quite often the grammar and the lexicography in these 3 Deuteropaulines, which are also present in the Marcionite collection, although shorter, as I said. They are conflicting and they are pretty different from the lexicography and from the terminology, from the semantics, from the grammar. So the entire style, I would say, is different compared to the 3 letters, the Deuteropaulines, and the 7 letters, the Pauline letters, even in the version that we have in the Marcionite collection. Now comes another feature which is quite interesting. When we compare these Deuteropauline letters, the 3, with the texts that are missing in Marcion's 7 letters. So I just mentioned Romans 15:16, 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8-10, and so forth. We notice that in these passages, which are present in the canonical New Testament and in the canonical collection of Paul, the language in these parts and the lexicography, even the grammar, relate more closely to the Deuteropaulines than the 7 letters. And that brought us to the idea, and I think we can make a very good case in the reconstruction, which is being published in sometime this year in summer, probably in autumn, that the Deuteropaulines, as they were already handed over to the Marcionite redactor, are closely related to the additional texts that we find in the canonical collection of Paul. And that lends to the argument that the people who have produced these Deuteropauline texts, which means letters explicitly set under the name of Paul, that the same people who have written these texts in the name of Paul have also added text to the Marcionite collection of the 7 letters in order to produce their own collection of the 14 letters. Now that even lends itself that we have closer parallels between the so-called pastoral letters, so the pseudo-Pauline letters, and Hebrews with the canonical texts and areas and the Deuteropaulines. Now, this sounds all complex. Maybe just a clarification before we continue. Today's scholarship says that the canonical Pauline collection of 14 letters is made up of 7 letters that most scholars would attribute as genuine letters to Paul. Then come the 3 so-called Deuteropaulines. Deuteros means second. So they are second-hand letters, not written by Paul, but as scholarship today says, in a school of Paul, somehow related to him in his spirit, but deviating in content and in language. And then come the so-called pseudo-Pauline letters, which are neither by Paul nor by his school, but by people who have nevertheless taken his name and written letters in his name to other people, but erroneously using his name, and that's why these letters are called pseudo-Paulines. And there are 4 most important ones because they are part of the canonical collection. 2 of them are addressed to Timothy, 1 addressed to Titus, and then the letter to the Hebrews. So these, just for clarification of the nomenclature. Now, interestingly, only the 3 Deuteropaulines are part of the Marcionite collection of 10 Pauline letters. Hence, he has the 7 plus the Deuteropauline 3. But he doesn't have any pseudo-Pauline letters, so neither the pastoral letters nor the letters to the Hebrews.
So I'm going to take a couple of questions real quick. Let's see. We'll start with Jack Patterson. Jack says, what's the earliest mention in the Marcionite collection?
The earliest collection, the earliest mentioning of the collection is indeed Irenaeus. So he is the first one who talks about the letters that Marcion has put together in his collection, and he quotes from them from time to time. Interestingly, the first who writes about and even addresses a text to Marcion, is Justin Martyr. But he doesn't talk about Marcion's New Testament, which comprises 1 gospel and those 10 letters, plus his preface. He doesn't say anything about that collection at all. And he even doesn't mention a canonical collection. So that's the other interesting phenomenon. And your question is quite a nice one, because it also shows us that even the canonical collection of Pauline letters is not mentioned before Irenaeus. That is quite a phenomenon too. So we have even not the mention of the canonical New Testament under that title ever before Irenaeus. Irenaeus is the first witness to both, to Marcion's New Testament, and interestingly, whenever he speaks about the title New Testament, Irenaeus always means not his collection, but the collection of Marcion. Likewise, the next witness that we have is Tertullian. Tertullian writes about the beginning of the 3rd century, so roughly 20 years after Irenaeus. And we have the same phenomenon. Whenever Tertullian talks about the New Testament under this title, he always refers to the Marcionite collection, not to any canonical collection. Only after Tertullian, in the mid of the 3rd century, we have for the first time with Origen the reference that the New Testament is now referred to the collection of 20 or 26, 27 books as we have them in our so-called canonical New Testament. So the earliest evidence that we have for any collection is Irenaeus and then Tertullian. And you can see from Tertullian, who is the first commentator of Paul in history. He doesn't write a commentary on the canonical collection, but on the collection of Marcion. So earliest evidence that we have refers to Marcion, at the same time also to these other letters, particularly to the pseudo-Pauline letters that were of interest to Irenaeus, as well as the Deuteropaulines, which were highly regarded by Irenaeus, and Tertullian. But there is a clear preference in the authority and the way that is there, which is given to the Marcionite collection. Hopefully that addresses your question.
Restless says, I have heard other scholars who said that the letters are less tested than Marcion's gospel. How can you be so sure that many sentences are missing?
Oh, that's a good question in many ways, because I think it is first of all, a factually wrong statement that the letters of Paul are less tested than Marcion's gospel. You only need to read the very first one, who has put together a rudimentary, I'd say, reconstruction of the Pauline collection, and that was Adolf Hilgenfeld in the 19th century, before the mid of the 19th century. And he had exactly the opposite opinion from what you were stating here. He was an optimist and said, well, no, the Pauline letters are better attested than Marcion's gospel. Why? Because the people who discussed the theology of these texts, particularly of the gospel, they were not interested in, let's say, the circumstances, whether Jesus went up or down a mountain, or where he sat, or what happened to ABC. But they were more interested in the core sayings and in the message that is being portrayed both in the Marcionites' gospel or in the canonical gospels. And that's why Tertullian and also Epiphanius usually concentrate on this message part. Now, when you report about letters, there is not much which is not part of the message. And that's why Hilgenfeld thought that the letters are pretty well, even better attested than Marcion's gospel. But the second part of your question, I think, puts the lens on the right spot. Because the question is, of course, how can we be sure that passages are missing? Now, I've given you, first of all, those passages which are clearly attested by our witnesses that they were missing. So, for example, we have our witnesses telling us that chapters 15 and 16 were missing in Marcion's Romans. Origen has a clear statement that the collection of Marcion ended with the last verse of Romans 14, and here we are with the witnessing. Then we have clear informations by Epiphanius and by Tertullian that more than pages before a section, more than pages were missing. It becomes a bit more tricky when we have no statement by our witnesses whether a chapter is missing or not. I give you the example of 1 Corinthians 16, where we do not have our witness accounts whether this chapter was or wasn't present. And in this case, we have to apply our reconstructive methodology. Now, the earlier reconstructors, so Hilgenfeld and then Theodor Zahn, Adolf von Harnack, Schmidt, and lately Jason Bedun, they all worked on the same principle. And that's why the results are not so different from all these earlier reconstructions. They were careful by looking at those passages which are not attested. And in previous times, Hilgenfeld, Zahn, and Harnack, they looked and discovered that in those passages which are not attested, quite often a kind of Orthodox, or if you like to say Catholic, or non-Marcionite, let's put it that way, theology was present. And that was for them the criteria that they either kept a passage in the text or discarded the text from the Marcionite collection. Now, Schmidt and others have pointed out that this is a circular basis and a circular argument which we should not use, because it assumes already that Marcion was redacting the existing canonical texts and that he has left out what didn't suit his own theology. However, the theology of Marcion, the same people, Harnack, Zahn, and Hilgenfeld, took from the way they reconstructed the Pauline texts and the gospel. So there was a certain circularity, and that was the reason why Schmidt, who believed that Marcion didn't change much on the text, but relied on the text as they were given to him, that we should not approach a reconstruction from this point of view. And nevertheless, We then have Jason Bedouin, who noticed, just like other people like Klinghardt and so forth, they noticed that certain terminologies were specifically absent from the Marcionite collection, and tried to reconstruct from a more semantic and a narrative background whether or not a passage was present or not. I find that also not sufficient. But when I started reconstructing these texts, I found one criterion which has already, as I just indicated, been occasionally used by earlier people and scholars who have reconstructed this text, but never in a systematic way. And for that very reason, did I start putting together an entire concordance, which means this is a lexicon of all terms, of all words that appear in the canonical New Testament. Now we have about 5,500 different words that appear in the canonical New Testament. And I started from looking which of these terms appear in the Marcionite texts as far as witnesses give us this text as assured texts. And it was so interesting to see that we have about 1,002 or 300 words in the Marcionite texts that are attested for this collection, both the Gospel and those letters of Paul. And I discovered that most of the texts which are witnessed texts, so texts attested, that these terms reoccur in other places that are also attested for Marcion's Paul. And when we then take a section, let's say chapter 16 of the first letter to the Corinthians, which in my view is absent, if we compare the lexicography in this chapter, and you can do the exercise yourself because I've published the concordance, so you can go through the concordance, just look up the words that appear in 1 Corinthians 16, and you will discover that the vast majority of that language is unattested for Marcion. So, to answer your question in full, the language, and you can go from lexicography from the individual words to grammatical constructions to the small words particularly, you will discover that those texts which in my reconstruction and which is checked with the team, because it's teamwork that we've done, it's Mark Bilby, it's Jack Bull, it's Lance Lathrop, we have discovered and we show that according to the lexicography, these texts which are absent from our reconstruction for Marcion are assuredly of a nature which is identical or very, very close to the canonical language, grammar, style, and all the rest of it.
How does Marcion portray Paul in contrast to how the canonical text portray Paul? What are the main differences?
Yeah, let's first start with from outside, not from the theology. We'll come to theology in a second step, perhaps. So, who is Paul in the Marcionite collection in contrast or in comparison with the canonical Paul? Let me start with the canonical Paul because you know Paul a bit better in this way. Canonical Paul has two, if you like, two profiles. One profile is the profile that is given through the book of Acts. Because from around chapter 8 or 9, Paul becomes the protagonist, the main player of the book of Acts, right to the end of that book. And a lot of the canonical material, particularly, which is different and which is missing in the Marcionite version, portray Paul precisely according to that profile which Acts has given to Paul. I give you one example or a few examples. One is Paul is the big missionary. He goes on 3 missionary journeys to convert particularly Jewish synagogue communities to Christian communities. He is restless, so he moves from one city to the next city. In the Marcionite collection, Paul is also traveling a bit, much less, not because the texts are shorter, but the 10 letters of Paul only know of one journey. A second element of the portrait that is given in Acts is that Paul is the big organizer. He brings together communities, he supports communities. One of the major communities to which he always attaches himself and goes back, asks, is Jerusalem. Of course, as Acts says, he is bound to Antioch and he is being sent from Antioch to Jerusalem. But Jerusalem is the community which has the say. Here are the 3 pillars, James, Peter, and John, who are in charge and with whom Paul has to somehow relate. They make a deal. They are looking after the Jewish communities. He has a bigger job to go out to the pagans. Now we know he not only went to the pagans, but according to Acts, he also goes to Jewish communities. But he is the big organizer. And in order to support his missionary activity, he asked the communities to put together a collection of money, which he carries with a few people up to Jerusalem, hands it over. This collection is being mentioned as it develops in Acts. It is also part of the 14-letter collection of the canonical Paul. It comprises 2 full chapters in the epistle, the second epistle to the Corinthians. It is mentioned in Romans 16. So it is a very important task, amongst which Titus, for example, has a big job. So Paul is not only the missionary, he's also the financier. He is the person who looks after the communities, brings the people together, brings the money together, and makes the relation with Jerusalem. All of that, you will not hear a single word in the 10-letter collection of Marcion. The Jerusalem collection is unknown. The only indication that is given in the letter to the Galatians is that when Paul meets the 3 and the other apostles in Jerusalem, they agree that both sides are caring for the poor. Both sides. There is no mention of Paul scrapping money and bringing it together as a collection to Jerusalem. Unknown, unheard of. So it appears that the canonical Paul in these letters is built around the model that Acts provides. A third element which Acts gives us is the so-called fixed chronology, because we know from Acts how we can chronologically order Paul's life. So Paul is, let's say, supported by historical evidence. 2 are of the main substance that scholars usually take as grounding the secured, as they say, chronology. It's the so-called inscription of Gallio, the prefect, and it is the expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem. From Rome, of course. Now, what's with the inscription of Gallio? Gallio is being mentioned in an inscription according to a finding that we have, an archaeological element, and he is mentioned in Acts 18. So scholars were saying, oh, since we now have the inscription as an archaeological find, we know Gallio is not just a literary figure in Acts, but he was a prefect. And this stone, which we have found in Caesarea, locates chronologically Paul in the vicinities of 49, 50, 51 in Caesarea. However, Acts 18 is not corroborated with the Pauline letters. So we don't have any secured element in the Pauline letters for that. So we have to rest on Acts 18. And very similarly, we know from Acts that we have a expulsion of Jews from Rome because there was a certain, oh no, I got it wrong. I better drink a strip. It was an expulsion from Jerusalem, of course. And that people were expelled because they were revolting and in the name of Christus. Again, Acts 18. Now we have Sueton, who assures us that there was this type of an expulsion by the Roman emperor. People again, like with the stone of Gallio and the inscription, say, well, therefore we have an assured testimony that this had happened and people were and had to leave the city. Both chronological fixations, however, we can only find in one single chapter in Acts 18, as I mentioned. The big problem, of course, is because there's no such findings which we have either in the canonical or in the pre-canonical texts in Paul's letters that we can support that statement. However, what we have is the reference to the couple of Prisca and Aquila. And that's the couple which, according to Acts, had to leave. And this is also mentioned again in Romans, exactly in those chapters which are missing in the Marcionite version. So we have the same phenomenon. The picture of Paul with these letters are in harmony, at least to some extent in harmony, with what Acts is giving us as a portrait of the historical Paul. And that tells us that the canonical collection of these 14 letters are not only built around Acts, but are also mutually endorsing themselves for giving Paul a historical configuration, if you like. This, again, is missing in the Marcionite collection. So if we only stick to Marcion's collection, the question becomes a viral question, whether Paul was indeed a historical figure. From the Marcionite collection, we cannot draw that conclusion. And if we were to give credit to Nina Livesey's new book on the letters of Paul, whereby she predominantly looks at the 14-letter collection, so the canonical Paul, she highly is skeptical of a Paul behind the 14-letter collection, because she thinks that typically for 1st and 2nd century, such a collection of letters is a pseudonymous attribution to a non-existing historical figure, but as a literary figure. Now, if we take Marcion's collection, that would probably support her case to some extent at least. Why? I still think also the Pauline collection of Marcion gives us a potential hint that there is, if not a historical person of Paul behind it, but at least an earlier layer of collections that we can see from the fact that Marcion's collection embraces already or brings together already two earlier collections of which we otherwise do not have any witness. To come back to the first question that's been asked. So it is just Marcion who indicates, by having brought together two different collections, that there existed prior collection before he brought them together. And how can I be sure of that? When you look into the lists of letters that are given with only very slight differences by Epiphanius and Tertullian, we can see that Marcion's collection of 10 letters started with Galatians and not with Romans. Then came 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and then came the letter to the Romans, and then the other 3 letters, plus the 3 Deuteropaulines. Now, the 3 Deuteropaulines, only in the Marcionite collection, are sticking together. Whereas if you open your New Testament and if you look into the manuscripts of the canonical New Testament, you will see that out of the 800 manuscripts that we have for Paul's letters, the 3 Deuteropaulines, in the order as they come in the canonical manuscripts, are not listed in a block. In between each of these Deuteropauline letters, we have one of the 7 so-called authentic Pauline letters. This by itself, by the way, is an indication that the older collection must have been Marcion's. Why? How on earth could a redactor pull out of these 14 letters those 3 letters which today's scholarship, modern scholarship, qualify and give the title of Deuteropaulines? So if Marcion, as Irenaeus then claims and Tertullian repeats, if Marcion had made his collection on the basis of the canonical collection, he could have never ever sensed that these 3 letters had to be pulled together. How? Or we would credit him with such a fine nose and such a fine feeling that out of 14 letters, he picked 3 letters, exactly those letters that today's scholarship put together, that he picked those 3 letters and put them into one basket as part of his collection. The other direction of work is historically the only plausible one, namely that the Marcionite collection of these 10 letters, where the 3 Deuteropaulines were part of, that the canonical redactors interspersed these 3 letters with 7 letters of Paul because they wanted to integrate the 7 and the 3 to form a more coherent collection. And yet, even they do the same thing as Marcion did, namely they leave the so-called pseudo-Pauline letters together. The pastoral letters stand also in one block. So just from the outside, 2 pretty different poles, if I like to say. When we look into the content of the 2 collections, so what kind of style do they have? How does Paul write in the one collection and how does Paul write in the other collection? So we move from external chronology and collection, we move a bit closer to the content. The style of both collection is, I might say, totally different. The 10-letter collection of the Marcionite Paul is like a script for a classroom. So if we take just like lectures, it is an argument that is being developed. Some of the questions are being mentioned, the arguments for that question, a position is being placed, more a rational discourse. Very, very rarely is Paul bringing himself in as with his own biography or with personal references. Very few historical relations he mentions. There are just 6 names that are mentioned in the Pauline 10 letters. One of it is Titus, for example. Yeah. But overall, a rational style, very few addresses to the addressees, very few moral exhortations, and so forth. The contrast you will find when you read these 2 versions of the letters in parallel. The canonical Paul, right from the beginning, after addressing the addressees, he starts usually, in most of the letters, with a big thank you, where he makes quite often references to his own state, where he is, what he does, what he suffers from, and where he thanks the addressees mostly for very personal things. In many ways, these letters in the canonical texts are then exhortations, and they read like a sermon on a Sunday. What people should do, what people shouldn't do. In addition, we have a number of almost like case law, where in detail it is being said what, for example, people should do when somebody marries a pagan, either a woman or a man. What people should do and should not do. There are moral statements overall to places. And in addition, we have a strong statement about slaveholding. Now, slaves or slaveholding is unknown to the Marcionite Paul. No mention of any slaveholder. The only mention is that human beings are servants of the divine, of the Lord, of God. But human beings do not have slaves. Another detail which is very important for the canonical Paul is inheritance. Inheritance, particularly in the wake of Abraham's promise. So it's inheritance of the trust that God has given and the land that God has promised to Israel. This is inherited by the Christians. And we have these long sections, particularly in the Epistle to the Romans. In all of Marcion's letters of Paul, the only inheritance there is the inheritance of the kingdom of heaven. People do not inherit anything of these and in this earth. We have a kind of asceticism, if you like, in relation to property. And that is so different in the canonical Paul, where land is being transferred, is being owned. And don't forget how important land and ownership and property is in Acts. Right in the beginning, we are told that people should have everything in common. They have something and they have it in common. And we then learn quite quickly that we have couples, members of the community, who do not share and who do not sell off. So they own and people have their material. So there is almost an obsession with either being poor or owning things, and particularly of inheriting things. And now you can see the exact same theology in Marcion's, same theology of non-inheritance in Marcion's gospel. There we have the beatitude, blessed are the people who are poor, because they will inherit the kingdom of heaven. Only in the canonical Matthew, which is not part of Marcion's gospel collection, because he only has one, we read in Matthew, blessed are the poor because they will inherit the land. So here we have land, inheritance, and ownership. So you can see a canonical Paul has a similar theology, which is then to be found again in the canonical Gospels. And just likewise, Marcion's Paul aligns closely to Marcion's Gospel. And that's one of the reasons why we think that the redactor who has redacted Paul's letters also has either redacted or heavily written the Gospel that we have in Marcion's collection. So when we compare style and content, we can see a spiritualized Paul in Marcion's collection and a more heavy-handed, if you like, homiletic leader of a community, an organizer in the canonical collection. When it comes to some other elements where they differ to a large extent is the position of women in the community. In Marcion's collection, as I already mentioned earlier today, women are of equal standard. We know that even in this community, according to Tertullian, he was speaking of the holy women. Women were able to prophesy and apparently held positions in the community. And only in this one element I mentioned earlier in the letter to the Laodiceans, Ephesians, in canonical text, we have that mention of women being below men. But that is unlike the 7 letters that he, in his redaction at least, of Paul, is present. Now we have this statement, of course, in the canonical text, a very strong statement in 1 Corinthians 14:35, that women should be subjugated and should be quiet, should shut up in the community, that they're not allowed to speak, and that they should listen to their husbands. Right the opposite we read in the Marcionite collection. Here we have a similar statement, but the statement is in a different place than in the canonical collection. And where it is in the Marcionite collection, after 1421, it is part of a section where Marcion shows with a very few words that it is more important to prophesy and that one should not use the language of tongues. And then he gives 2 examples where his community differs from what is being prescribed in the Torah and in the prophets. One is that the Torah speaks of speaking in tongues, that God himself was speaking in tongues. And the second element is that in the prophets and in the Torah, it is said that women should keep quiet in the community. So Marcion is against this statement. And that's why Tertullian and Epiphanius say, well, Marcion, if he makes these statements, he destroys the law. Indeed, he wanted to destroy the law in this respect because he wanted to have respect for women and he wanted to endow women with all the qualities and with all the abilities and possibilities in the community to preach and to prophesy. So we have a startling contrast in this particular element. And let me finish with the last one here. When it comes in 1 Corinthians 7, for example, talking about marriage, The Marcionite Paul allows for marriage because he says there are gifts of grace, the one, so the other, in a different way. The best thing is to stay as I am, being non-married, celibate. But if there are people who are having the gift of being married, so be it. However, he adds, even if people are married, it should be chaste. There should be no sexual union, even within marriage. So he has a very strong asceticism set out with his Pauline text. And you can see when you compare what the canonical redactors are doing with this text, they are working a bit around. They still leave in some of the ascetic elements, but they allow for a sexual communion in marriage. So again, a stark contrast. Now, when we look into the historical context, it's interesting to look, for example, into the letters of Dionysius of Corinth, because Dionysius of Corinth writes, we know of 8 letters that he has written. Letters are not preserved, but Eusebius gives us content reports about those 8 letters. And in one letter, he speaks about that the letter is directed against Marcionites and Marcion's theology and position. Another letter, where he doesn't mention Marcion, but he writes to a bishop in Crete, Pinutus, and he advises this bishop that he shouldn't be as ascetic as he is. Now we have also the report by Eusebius how Pinutus replies to Dionysius. And Pinutus writes back to Dionysius and says to him, well, you shouldn't do what you did. You shouldn't ask me to feed my people with milk as one feeds children. These are adults, and hence they should have adult food. Which means Pinutus was of the same ascetic opinion as Marcion was, and we can see the idea that the Marcionites at the time, with these strong ascetic positions, and probably with other positions too, were not yet heretics. Pinutus was not a heretic. Pinutus was somebody to whom Dionysius writes, praises. So the Marcionite ideas were very core to people who belong to the same group as Dionysius belongs to. So we should be very careful in not confounding later demarcations between people who are strong ascetics, like Marcion was, and none or less ascetics as we have them in Tertullian and in the bigger churches. So for this type of moral questions, ethical questions, questions in the community, but we also have theological differences. For Marcion and in the Marcionite Paul, it is important there is a difference between the absolute transcendent and the God that has created this world. God, who has created this world, had no knowledge whatsoever of the transcendent God. So the Paul of Marcion differentiates between Christ's God, the transcendent God, the very good God, and the demiurge who has created this messy world. Sometimes even one gets the impression this Paul would call him Satan himself. He sits and wants to sit in the temple, but he has no knowledge of God, and he has no knowledge of what Christ is revealing to us. And hence you can see what we know of by Tertullian and others, that Marcion differentiates between an unknown God who has only been made known by Christ, his Messiah, is exactly the position that we find in the 10-letter collection of Marcion's Paul. There's also one big difference with regards to the divine. In the canonical collection, many, many instances, we find that the divine God, the God who created this world, also is the judge of this world, the judge of the people. He's even the one who persecutes. He's the one who drove Pharaoh into the Red Sea. And so he is, as with Daniel, having a Messiah who also fights his war and kills the wrong princes. And so he also judges human beings at the end of time. In Marcion's Paul, God never judges. He always forgives. The only problem where people are judging and judged are that people judge over others and judge themselves. And that's one of the reasons why Revelation should tell us and Paul should teach us that people should abstain from judging and rather start loving. So we have again, from the divine across the Messiah, right to the end of times, a very different Paul in the canonical collection from what we can notice and read in the 10-letter collection of the Marcionite Paul. A Marcionite Paul who either Marcion has taken his theology from this Paul, and the same kind of theology we also find in the Marcionite collection of his gospel. Yeah, I'll leave it to that for the moment.
Christian Michael, thank you for your super chat. How do you explain that Colossians chapter 4 is absent from your apostolos in the supposed Marcionite prologue uses Colossians 4:17, Archippus accepted the ministry?
Very good question, Christian. It shows that you have done more than your homework. Now, I've also riddled with this question, and it's not the only position where the prologues have sometimes relations to the to parts that are missing. But the question implies somehow, and I think that's where we get potentially an answer. The question presupposes that when we have the prologue with Archippus there, and if we have Archippus in chapter 4 of Colossians, then it is likely that chapter 4 was already there when the prologue was written. But it could be the other way around, because we have sometimes a name in the prologue, a redactor who has worked on the prologue and on the Marcionite's collection could have easily used exactly those names which are only part of the prologue to put them into a chapter which he has added to the text. Because don't forget, we have to explain the fact that this collection, apparently not known as a collection before Irenaeus, has also, or needed, the authority. When we compare what people quote and make use of in the 2nd century, we can see that they're making use of Pauline letters, but that they never refer to this canonical collection shows the need of authority. And when you read through Irenaeus against the heresies, one of the main targets that he sets himself is to create that kind of authority for the collection that he has in hand, which means for the 4 Gospels, and he's the first to endorse these 4 Gospels. And in the same way, he endorses right from the beginning when he starts quoting. He endorses the pseudo-Pauline, which means the pastoral letters, as well as the Deuteropaulines and the canonical versions of Paul. So I think your question is potentially best answered by saying, well, the redactors of the canonical text have done everything to insert names like Archippus, insert names which they have found either in the Pauline text or in the prologues, and put them precisely in those chapters which they have added. I give you another example where we have a same or a parallel case. Out of the 3 pastoral letters that have been added to the canonical Pauline collection, 1 letter is addressed to Titus. Now, Titus is exactly one of the very, very few names that you find as a co-worker in the 10-letter collection of Marcion. And here you can see the parallelism. They haven't written a pastoral letter to Silas or to whoever. No. They forged one of the 3 letters to one of the co-workers which they have found by name in the letter to the Galatians of the Marcionite collection. And I think that is the parallel case to Archippus. From a Pauline, from a Marcionite prologue, they have taken that name and placed it into chapter 4 of Colossians. Interestingly, if I just may finish that thought, they added 2 more letters in the pastoral collection. Those are addressed to Timothy. Now, Timothy never ever occurs in the Marcionite collection. How come that the 2 letters are written to Timothy? You only need to open Acts again. Timothy is a most important person in Acts. And in order to remediate the Marcionite collection of Paul, Timothy is almost sprinkled over the various letters of Paul in the canonical collection. He even becomes one of the regular co-authors of Paul. Or in 1 Corinthians 4, he is even mentioned within the text. And Paul explains how important and trustworthy Timothy is. To then add his statement about the morality, where he talks, most people say, against homosexuality in 1 Corinthians. Certain reference to Timothy before. And precisely in the first letter to Timothy, this morality against homosexuality is repeated. And so people make the connection between the letter to Timothy and a similar message related and connected with his name of Timothy in 1 Corinthians. And then we are not surprised that the letter to the Romans, you will find in chapter 1, another very similar statement against homosexuality, right in the opening of the collection of the 14 letters of Paul in the canonical version. So this is the way I think these names work. Some have been found, like Titus, and been reused for creating forged letters, like the pastorals. Other names, or like Archippus for chapter 4 in Colossians, other names like Timothy are newly introduced, but in order to make them fix, they are being introduced over a wide span in the 14-letter collection of Paul.
Can you ask if in the reconstruction there is any evidence of Marcion holding what modern readers might see as anti-Semitic views? Are there examples of Hebraisms in Marcion's New Testament, says Run and Shoot?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would even say in the Marcionite collection, we have no anti-Semitisms. We have even, because we have this question of inheritance, we have even note the idea of taking over from Israel or from the Jews what they have. The only, and I wouldn't diminish the problem here. The only lately fatal question is that Marcion, although I think he comes from a Jewish background, which we can see from the commentary in Tertullian, but also we don't have any other example in the first hundreds of years that people know so much from the Jewish Bible as Marcion does. So it would be extremely surprising if he was not educated in a Jewish environment. Having said that, the fact that in his antithesis, in his preface, he makes that kind of a differentiation between, on the one side, Israel, or the Jews, as he says, Judaism he talks about, which is one of the very rare appearances of that kind of an abstract for the Jewish practice community or practicing community. So he makes that distinction between Judaism and Christianismos, or Christianismum in Latin, in Tertullian. So for the first time, I think, he conceptualizes two Jewish movements into organizations or into abstracts. And this kind of an antithesis or a contradiction, as he says, between Judaism on the one side and Christianity on the other side, that could be read, if you like, anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. But in his case, I would give him credit that he didn't mean to set them in a fight against each other. On the contrary, we have this marvelous example in the Sermon of the Plain, where in the Gospel we have this story, you know it, of the wineskins and of the cloth. And there he says, well, if you put new wine in old wineskins, so his idea of the Messiah bringing his new message, and if you bring this new message of Christ into the wineskins of the Jewish Bible, what happens? The new wine will burst. It gets lost, but it also makes the wineskins, the Jewish Bible, burst, and they get lost. And we have a statement which is only preserved in Codex Bezae, but most likely was part of the Marcionite Gospel there, that when you, and if you, put new wine in new wineskins, then both is preserved, the new wine and the new wineskin. But as a correlation, also the old skins are preserved. So both is preserved means not just the Christian elements are preserved, but also the Jewish ones are preserved. And here you can see the first, in my eyes, anti-Jewish statement, a very strong one, is not by Marcion, but by his somehow interlocutor, critical interlocutor, and that is Justin Martyr. In Justin Martyr, you read what you will not read in any of the Marcionite texts, neither Paul nor his Gospel nor his antithesis. Only in Justin we read a type of supersessionism, namely that Justin says to Trypho, what you think is yours, namely your scriptures, in effect is ours. You have no longer the right. And you can even, you're too stupid because you can't even read and understand your own scriptures. It's we, Christians, who understand and who own what once was owned by you. And you can see the difference between a Marcionite Paul and a Marcionite Gospel and a Marcionite antithesis, which sets out two different Jewish groups and leave the one Jewish group their scriptures, their interpretation, their practice, and within his own Jewish Christian group, a Messianic Jewish Christian group, Marcion wants to do his own, but leave alone what the others do. And that might explain why he separated between the two communities, but it was not an anti-relation. It was, if you like, a co-relation where everybody does it one's own way. And that changes dramatically with Justin Martyr. And you can only read what Tertullian writes about the Jews to see how the theology of Justin Martyr has developed into a Christian understanding, which then becomes an anti-Jewish and later, up to the Holocaust, the anti-Semitic movement. It is also interesting to see that in Marcion, we don't have that.
And for my final question, when was the canonical Pauline text created?
It's created, I think, in stages from the witnesses and from the reception that we can trace. According to Tertullian, Marcion complains about those people who have plagiarized his gospel and his Pauline letters. Now we could say, oh, well, that's just fancy of Tertullian. Apparently it wasn't, because we notice, for example, in Justin, but we can take Polycarp, we can take other writings from the 2nd century, and discover that they are relating to, if not even quoting, as Polycarp, for example, Pauline texts. And when we compare what is being quoted by these people or referred to, it is not, or very rarely, Marcion's collection of Paul. And the same is true for the gospel material. Now, also interesting, in Justin, as in all other authors before Irenaeus, they never quote the Gospels or the Pauline material in the extent that we have them, and in the form that we have them in the canonical New Testament. Now, what's different? Let's stick to Paul in this instance, yeah? They do not quote the Marcionite Paul. So they must have known pretty early on, so from about 150 onwards, they must have had a revised version of Marcion's Paul, because we find texts which people tell us were absent from Marcionite's Paul. However, what do they not quote or never refer to? Never to Hebrews, never to one of the pastoral letters, never to Romans 15:16, never to 1 Corinthians 16, never to 2 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. So what I'm trying to say is we have apparently, just as Marcion's gospel has been plagiarized in the years before 140, and before he then put together against those plagiarisms his New Testament, which he prefaces with the antithesis, where he complains about those plagiarisms. In this New Testament, he put together this preface, 1 gospel, and 10 letters of Paul. The people who plagiarized, who had put together these 4 gospels and the revised versions of Paul, had not put a collection together. So the Gospels existed, the letters of Paul were the revised version of Paul, of Marcion's letters, but there was not a canonical collection in existence, and that's why none of the authors, even not Irenaeus and even not Tertullian, ever talks about a canonical collection or a canonical New Testament. Didn't exist. But in the school of Polycarp, and under the eyes of Irenaeus, those other writings were put together. The pastoral letters, Hebrews, Acts, but also the Catholic letters, like the letters to Peter, letters of John, letters of Peter, letters of John, letter of James and Jude, and Revelation. And when you read Irenaeus' writing against the Gnostics, or the heresies, as he says, you will see that he makes use of most of all these writings and understands that these writings are in a collection. It should be in a collection. And this is the collection which apparently has no title yet, only comes together in the times of Irenaeus. So they make use of these revised texts which existed after 130, whatever, 38, 140, to which more writings were added. And I think they come from the school of Polycarp, and who is the teacher of Irenaeus. Irenaeus makes use of these material, makes a claim for a collection. And Tertullian likewise, but only with the times of Origen, it comes to that titling and also the publication and the putting together of what today we know as the canonical New Testament.
And I have the link to purchase Markus Vinzent's books in the description below, and also the link to Patristica tagged in the description below, and also to the Zenodo website, which hosts Markus Vinzent's, Mark Bilby's, and Jack Bull's reconstruction of Marcion's Apostolos. And that being said, Markus, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob. I think it's fantastic. Also, the questions show people of understanding are listening and engaging seriously. And as you know, we who attempt to do our best with our reconstruction, we are very much listening to the questions and also to the arguments and weigh those arguments. There is no dogmatic statement, and we hope to make progress and learn even more, because there's so many elements missing from the puzzle. So we try our best, but let's see.
Thanks, Markus. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.